I hope I can get through this recording because I'm coming down with the flu or something, and my throat is a bit bothersome, and I'm a bit tired. But I want to focus on sort of the issue of I've dealt with this before. No, I haven't. The kind of the derogatory term incel, or at least the stereotype, the toxic stereotype of incel. Obviously, incel just means involuntarily celibate, and it's meant to refer to adolescent and young men in general, but I guess could technically be, or men in general, I guess, as well. I do think that there is definitely a section of incels that are definitely toxic. And I believe that the reason why they are toxic is because they have effectively bought into the whole identity moral circus and parade, that identity is your salvation to some extent. And so essentially they've just sort of internalized a systematic oppression complaint. They've seen the popularity that feminism enjoys within the kind of the cultural currency to some degree. I mean, it does have pushback, but the kind of the mainstream cultural hegemony that it enjoys, you know, and identity politics in general. Although I'm going to argue that these issues, I think, are actually what are almost reflected in the Columbine shootings and things like that, which existed well before identity politics became its own thing. But when I think the gender corrosiveness around gender roles was already in the culture. So feminism, I think, was and sort of patriarchy and that sort of complaint was in the culture. Because I do think that identity politics wouldn't have even taken off without somewhat debasing almost the humanistic substrate that people are just naturally connected to, which is their sexuality. And I think that when you demonize masculinity, it hurts extroverts the most. It's interesting, like when you have a kind of new cultural hegemon, extroverts are generally the first to bend the knee because they just need to learn whatever it is in vogue. They need to sort of very quickly adapt themselves because the expression of their personality temperament depends on them being able to sort of adapt to whatever cultural norms are in force, as it were, and they don't want to be inhibited. They don't want to fall foul of any sort of norm. So they often have extroverts in general, as a generalization, I would say, as a kind of lowest common denominator social, kind of factor, they end up accelerating, let's say, new orthodoxies and groupthink. They try to stabilize and solidify them. Now, it just so happens that, let's say, some ideas are just so toxic, so poisonous, so sort of self-referential, so encapsulated within their own sort of narrow vision of their kind of their own paradigm, that and then the kind of behavior that it prescribes is, like, let's say, so subtextually disruptive, as feminism, you know, celebrates itself for being disruptive, for instance. Anyway, so I think that, I'm generalizing to some degree, but I think things like the kind of shootings and things like that, I think, is a symptom uh, of essentially, to vaguely generalize, uh, people that have been denied their own, let's say, extroverts that have been denied a functional role that they can actually inhabit, because what was being asked of them is just too far beyond, let's say, their inherent preference for behavior. They couldn't modify that much, and then they realized that essentially, to conform to this new hegemon, it was too self-eviscerating, as it were. It was just too. I mean, perhaps some extroverts that are more cerebral, perhaps can put up with this sort of adapting and sort of abstractly seeing themselves on the side of the right identity or something like that, or being a good ally or something like that. But extroverts that are perhaps, to use a word similar in how Sam Vaknin refers to species of narcissism, extroverts that are more somatic, that are more in their body, that are more in the experiential thing. If sexuality is something that is fundamentally, you see, it's one thing to, let's say, have a model of sexuality that you're not able to actually enact. So I mean, there's a perennial thing within culture where you have frustrated masculine sexuality. The frustration is not the problem. It's the demonizing of the model itself. So it's like, not only were these people unsuccessful, but it's like their goals were essentially made a kind of were debased and denigrated, and were seen as culturally, let's say, what's the word? Incommecchio. It was not. It's not a valid sort of form of activity or something like that. So it's like, and that for an extroverted personality. And so, I mean, I know this is going to sound a bit weird, because all these people that had psychological conditions and things like that, and I'm sure drugs were also sort of part of it, or narcotics, whatever you want to call it. Not, I mean the psychiatric drugs. But and these people perhaps seem much more like very or very shut in introverts. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'm sort of saying that that's what they've kind of resorted to, because of their inability to actualize and express themselves, which I do think has to do with this warfare that's happened on gender roles and gender politics, as it were, and this projection of gender politics onto adolescents and men. It forces them to deal with all these sort of cerebral, conceptual outlines, which are fundamentally, I don't think, are even soluble. They're not actually able to be, like you can come up with a kind of moral code and prescriptions, but they, like, if you actually try to actualize any of them, you just see how you run into fundamental dilemmas and paradoxes, and there's no way to really navigate it. There's a way to appear to navigate it, and usually that can only even occur by finding some pressure release valve, by sort of finding a scapegoat and sort of pointing at them and saying how they've got it wrong, and then in relation to that, you can feel more secure. It sort of it depends on that kind of just call it scapegoating. So what was I going to say? So, yeah, I mean, let me just get to my notes, because there were some other points that I wanted to make. Yeah, so I mean, in general, I do think that extroverted people are affected much more by this culture of identity-centric morality, and that we can sort of perhaps see that many of the people that are even the toxic incels are the unsuccessful extroverts, which would have been able to have some kind of meaningful place and serve some kind of function, but because of the kind of this all this barbed wire and sort of police tape around sexuality, it's just kind of frozen culture to such an extent that people can't find natural rudiments of how to articulate their personality in groups and things like that. That it's just sort of and so being dislocated from their own sexuality and stuff like that. Okay. And because this sort of this mountain of double standards and contentiousness and convoluted abstract rules, which like offer no clear way of how an extrovert might express themselves. So extroverts that are slightly more cerebral and high functioning can perhaps deal with some of these conceptual things and in fact leverage them in such a way as to safeguard themselves by throwing other people perhaps under the bus. So it actually creates this kind of slight almost human cannibalism to some degree, because like the actual conceptual structure itself is just fundamentally unsound, and this is how it's basically manifesting culturally. And essentially only the more cerebral extroverts can get with this abstract program of essentially justifying and providing themselves a kind of ideological security that they know that they're in the right, because they can sort of frame all their actions as being in the promotion of the interest of the right identity, that they can see themselves as allies to the identity. They can find a way to project that ideological framework onto their social interactions, which, as I said, also generally require some kind of pressure release valve. They require a scapegoat to say, oh, those people are doing it wrong and we're doing it right. So yeah, it yeah, uh, yeah. So now I'm going to go into more into the toxic side of incel thing as well, because in some sense it's bad because it can promote, let's say, the source of a second round of reactionary or toxic, because in some sense, let's say if you are an incel, and I mean that not that you're necessarily a toxic person, but that you just happen to be celibate, uh, and it's involuntary on your part in your assessment. There are two ways of taking this. You can say that you live in a hostile culture, um, and then you can just sort of try to cope with it. You can just sort of try to do what you can within your own sort of capacities and resources and your own choices and opportunities, and you can just try to follow them and sort of ignore the fact that culture is projecting a lot of stuff onto you, or the current cultural hegemon is quite uh, demonstrably bigoted, essentially, and and it sort of and it gets away with that bigotry because it's like literally redefined what common words mean. It's sort of infiltrated and given itself the authority to change and redefine things that now you can only be called prejudiced against someone if if your identity has power and privilege. So essentially you allow for this one-way bullying because someone is an effigy of the identity that needs to absorb some balance between the racial egoisms or between the gender role egoisms or something like that. So everyone becomes a token and is instrumentalized, and this facilitates like the one-way bullying. So as an extrovert who's not able to sort of understand that perhaps, okay, well, culture's not safe for me, or it's not safe for my preferential or inherent preference for behavior, but I'm just going to sort of say, okay, well, culture is just crazy right now. It's gone insane. It's been taken over by bad people. So I must just sort of try to be independent. I mean, that I think that's the positive adaptation. That's almost the silver lining on all these dark clouds, because hopefully we will get a better culture in that sort of vogue, in that valence, that will call people to an internal um, uh, critical independence and such. Um, and people will realize just how wrong authority can be. So hopefully there will be some gems that will grow up in this generation and such, who will be able to see the perniciousness inherent in ad hoc discretionary powers that administrators have, and they can be sensitive to institutional corruption and such. As this cultural hegemon has infiltrated academia, um, legal structures and institutional structures, workplace codes and things like that. Um, Google is a famous example of that, with James Damore. Okay, but what's my point? Yeah, I mean, it is problematic for a certain section of the population who are, let's say, naturally extroverts, and then they can't find a way to adapt to this cultural orthodoxy. And extroverts generally, as a sort of, they just want to get with whatever the program is, so that they can just be what's the word, so that they can sort of express their natural temperament. um, and so them being cut off from doing that, it's not a good time to be an extrovert, I guess, if you sort of follow what I'm describing. Um, and it does exacerbate the kind of conflagration, and it does also create the potential of having the pendulum building up its potential to swing the other way, which would be awful. Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that I just want to caution against is that the worst thing about, let's say, the incel toxic reaction, which is just sort of trying to phrase that as a kind of as the toxic stereotype, is the idea that essentially a counter identity politics to feminism, where it's the same kind of systemic oppression complaint. And I mean, there is something factual that approximates this, in terms of the kind of the cultural currency that women possess, in terms of um, uh, essentially never being accountable for their decision. If there's a man involved, somehow the buck is always sort of passed to the man. Um, and this, I think, is generally the reason why this trope even exists, is because that's generally speaking how female sexual selection occurs. Like that's the preferred, or at least the most popular female sexual selection strategy, is that uh, you find yourself gravitated towards someone who is able to offer you and outbid the other men in terms of what they can provide, in terms of what they can deliver, what is convenient and comforting, and sort of gives you the feeling of being able to protect your interests. Because this has had, from an evolutionary perspective, this has been better for the species, because younger women that are able to be, let's say, both protected and lavished with access to high status and secure amenities, or whatever you want to call it, wealth, or even they will tend to, in an almost a statistical sense, they will tend to have better children. So, I mean, in some sense, there is this almost horrible truth that, from an evolutionary perspective, the female interface in terms of the sexual marketplace is almost a zero sum competition in terms of getting the best man that sort of that they're able to sort of be in the orbit thereof, or to have in their orbit, and comparing them against the other sort of bidders, as it were. Um, we had, I think, principled equality in the 90s. We had that idea quite clearly. And I think almost there's been a pendulum swinging the other way when women realized that they didn't want to have the same kind of burden to provide and accountability. They wanted to almost go back to the traditional roles, which ironically, I think that's what feminism is actually inculcating. It's a huge anti-egalitarian move to essentially try to socialize the free drinks that women can expect in courtship. They want to sort of have a way to reliably extend the courtship period of the sexual interaction in the sexual marketplace. And essentially, women don't want to give up the exploitation of their own sexuality. Um, and they're just trying to transfer that same exploitation into another vehicle, uh, where the state is essentially facilitating that. And it's quite ironic because traditionally one could quite cynically argue that this is traditionally why women were not given the vote and not given political power, because they were seen as unaccountable and short-sighted in terms of being involved in their own sort of short-term gratification at the expense of because essentially that's what men always had to provide. Men just had to sort of pander to the sense of entitlement, and essentially, if he couldn't cut it, then you have male competition essentially driving that to just be a kind of a structural target, which women could impose by just having these kinds of standards that essentially become social constructs because of the conformity or of how women interfaced in the sexual marketplace. So by women acting as a block, they could essentially enforce moral standards, as it were. They could invent moral standards and norms. And so essentially women have used social norms and social constructs effectively to get what they want, whereas men have had to just sort of navigate those and still come out in some kind of still try to deliver some kind of high status thing that women will want to attach themselves and affiliate themselves with. So it's interesting. I do think that there is a valid sort of thing that, like, if women don't like society, they do actually have responsibility for how it has been constructed. I mean, I don't know why they call it a patriarchy. To me, that's because if you realistically want to actually look at the foundational the cultural components and structures that we have, can't argue that men impose them. You can argue that men maintain them by actually having to operate them and function through them. But I mean, that's a sort of a necessity. I mean, if men don't play the game that has already been set up, they just get cut from the squad. They just no longer become part of the gene pool. Twice as many men as women just don't leave any descendants. women are just automatically valued by the group, and our cultural sentiments mirror that. So essentially this ongoing female privilege, um, which is I mean, you could only argue against this in yeah, if you make very weird sort of cherry picked historical, um, you almost have to apply anachronistic sort of moral calculus to olden day people and the necessities of life, and you just you forget just how poor everyone was, just how poor the royalty were effectively, just how impoverished their lives were. And I mean, if you really want to look at a civilized society that was old, I think the only one that you could look at are the Russians, and how essentially they were rich enough and stable enough to actually um, perpetrate, which in some sense I think if you complain about patriarchy and capitalism to some degree, or I mean, although it was technically feudal, if you just look at how romanticism functioned, and then how empowered, how culturally empowered those women were in romanticism, um, and the norms of romanticism, and the authenticity and the kind of integrity that that the pair bond had. And I mean, if you're going to look earlier than sort of that almost period that sort of culminated in Napoleon's interference, but if you want to look earlier than that, I mean, you can argue that technically everyone was chattel. I mean, the everyone was almost relatively speaking somebody else's chattel. The whole system was just fundamentally bogged down in almost the political necessity of of a kind of economic, political, rivalrous dependency on. I'm talking about Western Europe, I guess, in particular, but yeah, I mean, I think things look bad ever since the fall of the Roman Empire. But I mean, again, okay, I guess that's also another good source. I mean, if you look at the power that women had, again, it was only cultural power, um, and sometimes political power of the very elite females. But again, like, there was only one emperor, so in some sense, there was only one notion that you had a kind of real sovereignty. There was only one person that could actually claim actual sovereignty. Um, although and essentially, women didn't have rights, but they, through their husbands or fathers, um, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, technically, they were chattel of their. I mean, it's probably not technically the right word, but functionally, they were chattel of the paterfamilias. But I mean, that system reflects the kind of political realism or legal realism which did facilitate a stronger culture, because essentially, just because something was technically, I mean, it was also conceivable that the emperor could have anyone executed for anything, So, I mean, that's the kind of legal realism that was in the Roman system. You can't merely just judge it. They didn't have a notion of human rights, um, which they would also not want to have, because um, who would prosecute it? Like, what would the remedy be? Um, it was that's what kept their society able to support multi faiths and be cosmopolitan, because it was so focused on the letter being realistic, the letter of the law being um, uh, having an even keeled reasonableness that everyone could understand. It wasn't the law wasn't a moral argument. The law was a practical implement to resolve things, and it did have a respect for raw power, essentially. And it was very interesting as well because there were some things that sort of did allow people to have some leverage against raw power, but it was a mitigated leverage. Like, for instance, if the emperor wanted you dead and then he sent people to execute you, then all of everything that you owned would be claimed by the state. But if you killed yourself, if you died by your own hand, essentially by almost by morally conceding the right of the emperor to do that against you, then because you killed yourself, you sort of your heirs could inherit. So it's a very sort of, yeah, I mean, human rights don't exactly fit into that kind of equation. But also, I mean, it depends, I mean, how you want to frame human rights. I mean, I would say that human rights is more of a philosophical notion than it is a practical sort of thing. Because if you try to positivistically structure human rights, you are somewhat undermining the conceptual outline itself. But anyway, okay. I was just talking about some kind of historical oppression stuff. But yeah, I mean, yeah. So I would say the biggest problem that incels have is just if they, or which they don't technically have just by them being incels, but that they might grow a proclivity towards some kind of identity politics, essentially fighting fire with fire, fighting the feminism that has made their lives harder, as it were, and then creating the exact same kind of complaint that has been levied against them, and sort of trying to react with it. And it's a very bad way of interfacing with the environment because it insulates yourself and it forces you to act out through your identity, and it also requires you to try and get special treatment for your identity and special rules that help to frame and safeguard your identity. And it's always framed in this defensive sort of thing. And in fact, you can only prove that you are actively defending your identity if you can actually find someone to suffer, um, or someone to bear some kind of brunt of that structure, that supposedly that morally corrective procedure that you're implementing. Because otherwise, how do you know that it's working? How do you know that now you're on the in group? Um, but essentially, it's just playing into the disgusting cultural currency that has been developed by the woke crowd, which is for basically it's getting into that same kind of relativistic tunnel. Yeah, I guess that's the only thing. Uh, and I think almost it's weird. I mean, this is just like a vague impression that I get, but when I watch uh, Bowling for Columbine documentaries, and I look at and just the feeling that I get, sort of not knowing these people directly, but the feeling that I get is that these types of people are people that were almost proto reactionary. They wanted their own identity politics, but essentially they were so isolated. It just didn't exist. They were like the proto feminists, in some degree. They were like, I mean, in the same way that I've said that Agent Smith in the Matrix movie is exactly like a feminist, a third wave feminist. That is what he is exemplifying. Um, And if you look at, and then you can see how he grows to just the resignation and resentment in his role of being an enforcer of the system, and he just wants to bring the system down. He just wants to make it new into a new image, into his own image of his whim or whatever, and which you can only do by essentially making everyone the same as you, by making everyone have the same sort of groupthink agreement thing or whatever. But okay, that's too vague. But these were people that perhaps wanted to turn like Agent Smith, but they didn't have. They couldn't just assimilate everything. They couldn't just take over, and there was no, sort of incel support group that they could join. Now that it's perhaps become more popular, perhaps these things do exist. I mean, I think I've even come across some of these sorts of people. And when I do come across them intellectually, I am able to sort of, I think, show them and model to them what is wrong with their ideology, effectively, with their reactive ideology. I think it actually hits home quite clearly when you say you were just doing exactly what the people that have hurt you are doing. That effectively becomes the bottom line. And that gives them, especially when you're young, that gives you something to sort of reflect on and see how that perhaps can work out in reflecting on it in your own life after sitting with it for a while, and then sort of evolving and maturing to some degree and becoming an independent, critical, functioning person. One that has the fortitude perhaps to transcend the kind of the cultural disruption that is occurring. This reminds me, I wanted to make another voice note of something completely different. Something about the tone to take when rhetorically dealing with identity politics. Okay, anyway, I'll make that a different video.